The question is two related parts. First, beyond basic self-care, what techniques or practices can we use to prevent chronic pain when we're in an unexpectedly stressful situation, such as dealing with a flood? The second part is, if we are anticipating a very stressful situation, such as a divorce or an impending death of a loved one, how can we best prepare ourselves to prevent a major pain event? And these are such important questions. So I have quite a bit of stuff to discuss related with this. Just give me a moment while I share. Okay. So can everyone see? Thumbs up. Okay. When you are in a situation that you know is stressful and it's happening and it's, you're just about to get into the middle of it, one of the first things that I recommend is to express. And the reason is that the emotions that are essentially, whenever you have pain, it's the emotions that we don't feel. Those are the ones that are stored in the body whenever they're repressed, avoided, or not acknowledged in some way. So there's a little bit more to this, as you'll see. But the point is it's not distract yourself away from the stress or the stressor or the situation. It isn't gaslight yourself as if everything's okay. Expression is really important. This can be writing, this can be screaming into a pillow, this can be crying in the shower, this can be anything you want that expresses the emotions that you're feeling. And the second related part is to make a habit of returning to baseline often. So you can see how expression and returning to baseline need to be in a bit of a balance here. Returning to baseline often, the rationale behind this is you need to look for as many ways to activate your parasympathetic or the rest and digest nervous system as possible. This is a very strategic point here as well, because what determines, in the animal studies that looked at what determines the strength of an emotional memory whenever it is first formed, is the amount of noradrenaline that is exposed to the basolateral amygdala. I know that sounds very, very sciencey there. The basolateral amygdala is the part of the amygdala that is in charge of creating new fear memories. So the more noradrenaline you have in your body, the more sympathetically aroused you are. There's a direct relationship between that and how strong a fear memory, a new fear memory, will be. So this is one of the reasons why finding ways to return back to baseline as much as possible is really useful. And you can also see that there's a bit of, it's not a contradiction, because partially through expressing the emotions, you release a bit of that tension and you release some of that sympathetic arousal. But you have to be sure that whenever you're expressing, you return back to baseline. And then whenever you feel safe to feel emotions again, you put that in there and then you return to baseline. So rather than, if you were to imagine it to be like a waveform getting really, really high, you make sure that you express and then you return to normal, express, return to normal in whatever pattern makes sense to you. For instance, if you're in the middle of a crisis situation, there's a balance there. But for instance, soon after, in the immediate hours after that stressor begins, those are a really critical time period. And I want to just sort of bring this back up to reinforce that sympathetic arousal is always part of the sort of the pain cycle. Whenever we have a pain experience that eventually becomes emotional learning and to create a pain memory, etc., negative affect and sympathetic arousal will always augment that pain experience. But by reducing the sympathetic arousal in the beginning, you can lessen how strong that that emotional memory, that fear memory will be. The next thing is neutralize triggers if possible. This is a big ask. So for example, a flood was mentioned. This may or may not be possible. You may or may not be ready for this. But one of the first things that came to mind whenever I read that was listen to thunderstorms, listen to tracks of whales playing in water or dolphins playing in water, something to where water is no longer a feared stimulus, or is as small of a fear stimulus as possible. So if you get to the point where like any water, you start to have this high anxiety sort of amp up in your nervous system, that means that it's no longer about the situation, it's about the learned association with water. So ways to, for instance, start to reduce, or you could call it habituation, you could call it desensitization, regardless of the terms that you use to describe it, finding ways to make that stimulus, that trigger, that emotional trigger, less fearful early on will help. And so that's one of the reasons why one of the first thoughts I had was listening to water in a relaxing way, because water is not the thing to fear here. Reinforce safety regularly. This relates to number 2, where you're returning to baseline often, but it's another way of regulating the nervous system. This can be affirmations, this can be hugging yourself, this can be receiving light, safe touch whenever you feel like being touched from family and friends. These are all ways that, for instance, if you include any of the self-regulation techniques covered under polyvagal theory, that would be number 4 here. And this is just to reinforce that sense of safety. Even if something happened, you are safe now. And so that would be, for instance, an affirmation. I am safe right now. You look around yourself, you see that you're physically safe, you're fed. Right now, I am safe, which is really all we can ever say. We can only say something about the current moment. And then the other thing is to remember, no memory is permanent. Even if something has happened and you do have the beginning of a fear memory, you can always revisit it. And whenever we post this, I can repost some of the links to the previous discussions about memory reconsolidation, but these are always things that we can reduce later on whenever we revisit the memory. So even a little bit of effort during the beginning of the creation of a fear memory will reduce the intensity that it's stored. And you can reduce that intensity each time you access the memory with something as simple as deep breathing. So that would be the first part of this. Now there are some other edges. And did Tony ask this? I have okay. Because I figured that, and because I know you, I figured maybe Tony would like some details. One of the reasons why I bring up emotional learning as well is whenever we look at science that has described the arc of the creation of chronic pain, and most of this is done by Vang Apkarian, our co-founder, you can actually break it up into multiple phases. It doesn't just start with the stressor. Some people have predispositions that allow them to access emotional memories more easily and to create emotional memories more readily. So there are some people who their brain circuits are already sort of primed, and that's not anything wrong with them. For instance, those brain circuits are also primed to learn positive emotions and positive emotional memories more strongly as well. But after the injury or stressor occurs, there's a transitional period between 3 to 6 months where the primary thing that predicts whether someone will go on to have chronic pain is how much communication there is between 2 brain regions. And that's the medial prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is often known as one of the brain's reward centers, and the medial prefrontal cortex does many things, but in this situation, it mediates emotional learning. So what you're looking at here is how, another way of saying this, whenever we think about reward, that might seem a little weird, but the reward of avoidance, the reward of safety behaviors, of doing something and preventing yourself from feeling more pain, or having the illusion that what you're doing to avoid the pain is preventing more pain from coming. In this way, how the emotional circuits are communicating is the thing that will predict whether someone goes on to have pain a year later. And this was done in a prospective study. So this is just reinforcing again the importance of emotions during that early period of time. And it also points to the idea that for months after a memory is created, it's still labile, it's still updating. So you still have this, big window of time. If it's an ongoing stressor like pain, you still have an opportunity to change how you're reacting to it, and to work on, rather than avoiding, sort of exploring and moving into pushing your limits in very gentle ways and reinforcing safety. So the science behind this is quite solid. And again, I also wanted to bring up, you've seen this before, but this is a reminder that the rules regarding the initial formation of a fear memory are the same as the rules regarding its reactivation and revision later on through memory reconsolidation. So if you're looking at a stressful event or a traumatic event, that first 4 hours is very influential in how it'll be processed in the next 2 weeks and sort of imprinted into the brain. That doesn't mean it can't be revised later on, but it just reinforces that there are sort of these critical windows that you can work within to reduce the intensity of the pain. So that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question was, if you know that a major life event is going to happen, such as a divorce or a death in the family, how do you prepare? And one of the best things I have for that is a combination of steps that are great for letting things go. This can be grief processing. These steps are discussed in terms of grief processing, but also often what is held on to following one of these big life events is all of these things that you didn't say and that you didn't express even to yourself. So it's stepping back from, so for example, in the example of a divorce, because the pattern tends to be blaming, you did this, I did this, etc. It's stepping back and creating a space where you can write about, independent of the person or the situation, this is all within you. How the stress is embodied is completely within your sphere of influence. Whether they keep on being resentful toward you has nothing to do with whether you're resentful toward them, for example. So writing out all of your resentments toward the person or the situation, or the person who might be close to passing, all the regrets that you had, things that you felt that you didn't do, that you could have done, something about the relationship that you wish had happened, but it didn't happen. This is just sort of like a brain dump. But it's also important to engage in the emotions of all of these things, because this is a form of therapeutic emotional writing care. Everything that you never said but you wish you did. And that's situation specific, and also acknowledging the person for what they taught you about yourself. So even in some of the most negative situations, maybe you learned more about your value, or how you were letting others violate your value, or how in the past you were perpetuating a pattern that you're ready to change. So in even the most negative situations, there are always lessons and things that we learn about ourselves. And it's just a reflection of what are those patterns. You don't have to say like, it doesn't have to be anything grand like I forgive and forget. It can be that, but even if it's just, I realize I need to create boundaries and I'm not going to be a punching bag anymore. You know, anything like that. That's what the acknowledgement about the situation means. And then whenever you're done, you've expressed all the stuff that you've been holding. That's whenever you can take the piece of paper and hold it, you know, it's outside of yourself now, you're holding it. I suggest doing some sort of affirmation that helps you feel peace. And this is just a suggestion, but this can be specific to you. But part of there are two kind of potent pieces in what I suggest here. One is releasing the weight of what you just described consciously. And the other is saying that you're taking your power back from that situation. So that was a very specific suggestion here for the type of affirmation that might work. But if that doesn't resonate with you, you can choose your own. And you might do this multiple times. You might do this in different pieces where at one point you write about one of these and then, you know, return back. But if you're processing all of these emotions before the event happens, there'll be less of an emotional burden associated with that event, whether it's a divorce or a death. You are carrying less in your body because you've expressed these emotions that have been in you for so long. So in a sense, it's sort of like proactive emotional healing. So instead of waiting for the event to happen and for you to have a reactional healing response, it's being a bit more proactive about it. So this is something I would strongly suggest. Yeah, it's in a sense, it's a proactive processing of some of these emotions. And I think, yes, and I think that's it. So I hope that is helpful. Tony, do you have any questions?
Whoops, disembodied again. No, I'm just really blown away how insightful and helpful that is. I can see applying it to so many situations, even small triggers of a previous experience that perhaps the reverberations of that experience don't have to play out quite as strongly if something like this can be applied too.
And that pattern, the resentment, regret, it's one of my favorite things. You can even, if there's a certain person in your life where you just have feelings about them, even if you haven't seen them in 5 or 10 years. I have done that pattern, that process, like dozens of times. And it's really helpful for letting go of things that just aren't serving you anymore. And also what you might notice afterward is your interactions with the person become a little more neutral, which is the cool part. And whenever that happens, that's also sort of an indicator, okay, I did. And the really cool thing about that is that it means that part of the tension of the interaction, it was being held in you, not in I don't mean that in a blame way, but it's your understanding of the situation shifted, and therefore that shifted how the interactions play out in real life, which is one of the amazing things about, that's why I love that protocol, that strategy so much.
It's brilliant. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's not mine. I got it from some very wise people.
But wisely imparted from you. Thank you.